You're listening to Content Logistics, a podcast for B2B marketers looking to build a content engine that drives revenue. In each episode, Camille Trent interviews the marketers behind the best content marketing flywheels and uncovers the tactical aspects of content production, from first draft to first customer.
Melissa, thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, we've been talking about this episode, or what we're going to do for this episode, for a couple weeks, and then it hit me with your comment the other day on LinkedIn. We're talking about media companies and talking about how to measure them, what is success in a SaaS media arm. And I was like, that's our episode. Let's just talk about that for an hour. So, before we get started on that, I think we need to align on the definition of a media company, right? Everyone's like, build a media company, do a media company. Not a lot of people are like, by the way, this is what a media company is, and this is how you can measure success within your SaaS company. So before we get started, I just want to go into, there are media companies that exist as media companies, right? Like that is their revenue. And then there are media companies within a SaaS business, right? Like SaaS businesses are either acquiring a media company or they're building a media company from the ground up. So are those things different, and how would you define a media company?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, so a media company is definitely where the content is the product. So they are creating the entire company, their entire revenue stream, or a majority of it is based off of the content that they're actually creating. Usually these companies have large...
Yeah, I mean, I like that definition.
Yeah, I mean, that's the easiest way to explain it. But, these companies are complex in the way that they operate. They have usually hundreds of people that are dedicated to just creating this content. And then they have people that are dedicated to mastering the distribution of it. So that's the way I look at like a tried and true media company. I would say that's probably shifting with the landscape of media in general. Like that's what it used to be. And the evolution of that is definitely tied much more to like media companies trying to think like SaaS companies in terms of the revenue that they're generating, like ARR. So we're seeing this really interesting, I think, like inflection point where media companies are trying to have the revenue models of SaaS, and SaaS is trying to go into media. And then, to your point, like building media within SaaS, it's really leveraging your voice to push out content that can resonate with much larger audiences. We like to call it like a digital billboard that can outlast paid media and really help grow organically.
Nice. Yeah. So there's two things that stood out. One of them was SaaS companies trying to act like media companies trying to act like SaaS companies, or both of them realizing that there's a benefit to each type of model. And I think now, like with the economy and with just the uncertainty with everything, I do see like the value in like diversifying almost, right? Diversifying your revenue streams, like diversifying like how you go to market to some degree. So I'll shout out Metadata, for instance. They have this community with sponsors, like paid sponsors for their community. And you could argue kind of like a media arm going with their podcast. And that could be standalone, like if they wanted it to be, but also they have the SaaS product that they sell. And so they have kind of like this diversified like portfolio of products, if you will, right? Like content and community products, and then their actual products, their SaaS product that they sell. And so you can see like when the waters are a little bit like choppy, that might be good to have multiple ways to make money, right? And so that part like really, really stands out, and one should get your take on that. Like, is that a reason to do both?
I mean, definitely. I would say it's different for different like sized companies, right? Like, in this day and age, if you're a small SaaS business that doesn't have a huge cash infusion, like how are you going to market? And that's like, you have to become a media company. You have to create content, and that extends way past now just creating a blog. So like, what does that model look like? I also think that, that is really smart. I mean, I believe in like media company, like it encompasses a lot, right? Like it can encompass your entire community strategy, your social strategy, your like actual content creation strategy, and then, any other things that you're doing internally to get your brand out there. So like internal influencers, or we can go into that later, what we're doing. But yeah, I mean, I view it as like, there's a lot of different ways to kind of like operate it. And it really is like a sum of its parts to me. But yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, having like that community, like that content strategy or media strategy for community led.
Yeah, the one other thing on here that you said that stood out is helping diversify your go to market. So especially if you're bootstrapped, right, or you don't have like the funding to kind of like get you through the next couple of years, like if you need that, you can have kind of this like self-sustaining go to market or like content program that sort of like funds itself, right? And so it's not necessarily like I'm going to rely on the content product like for revenue, but at least like marketing isn't draining our budget, right? Like it's becoming like an asset for us and it's self-sustaining.
Yeah. And I mean, like a lot of the podcasts I'm on, these are companies that are creating podcasts to create media, right? So, I mean, definitely. And also, if you don't have a ton of money to spend on ads and you have to find, your buyers, like, how are you going to do that? You're going to talk to people that would probably resonate from resonate from listening to conversations. Now, like, does this all become saturated and does it need to evolve? Probably. But, I mean, we saw that in like tried and true media. So I would imagine there will probably be a point. Luckily, we're not there yet. So the grass is still green, in my opinion, on like how brands can kind of move into that bucket. But I think it'll be very interesting to see like what the future of that looks like as every brand tries to do that to, have a better balance between their organic and paid growth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to shift like quite a bit just on what companies can do and what they're willing to do in the next couple of years. So like who's actually going to do it? Everyone's saying that they're going to do it. Who's actually going to do it is the real question. Okay, this is a good segue into purpose. So what would be like the purpose of a media company embedded into a SaaS brand?
Yeah. I mean, I think like there's a layer of it. So if you think of that as like the brand layer, right? Like you have a brand voice, a brand tone, you speak to your potential buyers in different ways, you have your segments. Within like, if you're creating a media arm and you really want to do it well and you kind of build a sub brand, you're able to say a lot more that doesn't feel like it's necessarily coming from the brand, but still speaking to the values of like culture that can attach itself to what you want to surround yourself and be surrounded with in terms of content. So I view it as like there's a little bit more leeway that you have when you're a media company, or you should have, to be able to go further and talk about different things that you couldn't when it's coming just from the brand. So that's sort of how I view it. There's different approaches to that. There's like, do we just want to create like a secondary company that has no affiliation to the brand so we can do whatever we want? I don't know. I don't think that's the way forward. I think the way forward is probably attaching a sub brand to your brand that it's kind of like, hey, this is, X, we're calling ours Friday by ClickUp. And Friday by ClickUp speaks to everything in work and culture and everything in between. We'll make fun of some of the things that you have to deal with at work and really just try to relate to people on that deeper, like emotional level. We'll inform you, educate you, and make you laugh. And that's sort of the goal of what we're doing. So we can reach people in very different, lot of different segments in a lot of different ways. And it's coming from the brand, but it's not necessarily from the brand. Just gives you way more wiggle room to try and test and learn and do different things.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this thing as marketers where we get nervous to the point of being slow in decision making because it's attached to the brand, right? Yes. Like, and you don't want to you don't want to mess with that to some degree. Yeah. But our whole life is also experimentation is so much of it, right? And so I do think that, having a media arm or having some sort of like sub brand gives you that wiggle room that you're talking about to do kind of like crazy things, to test things like in a way that you couldn't, like if you're having to do it under your brand name.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot of it's just perception and kind of the explanation of like that. Because the reality is it's still pushed out via our brand, but it's separated from our brand, which is funny.
Yeah, it's such a mental block in some cases. Another thing I was thinking about, so you talked about content being the product in a media company. What about community? Like, how does community fit into a media brand, or is it sort of a byproduct of media?
I mean, I think it depends. Like at BuzzFeed and like other media companies, the community is developed as a byproduct of the content that's being produced and the people rallying and listening and reading it together. Think of it almost like as like a version of Reddit, just based on like actual like produced content. But you have audiences, right? Like you already have your audiences. I mean, I feel the same way for B2B. Like, I think that community is such a huge part of it, but obviously you're kind of shaping those communities or you're guiding them a little bit more. In true media, you're really like not. Those communities are kind of coming together on their own and doing their own thing. Here, like you have to facilitate a little bit more, but it's definitely a part of that strategy. It's, there's product communities, there's user communities, and there's so many different types of actual like community within SaaS. It's actually, you kind of have to really create like programs to align to all of those different parts of the community. But I do think it's an important part. I mean, it's just not, it's sort of natural. It's just like for a B2B product, it's not as natural to just have like a huge, like rabid community versus like a traditional media company. But that is a great point. And I believe that if you do create the media, you can create that community. So it's sort of, it's nurturing and nurturing and nurturing. But like, I think those things will kind of like, intersect.
I think for me, like you have to think about them together when you're building the strategy or when you're creating the content of noticing or caring about which type of content your community or what you want your community to be is resonating with and making an effort to create more of that type of content. Right. And I think that's like the start of it. And then there's getting more into a real community, right? Or like shaping the community or letting it form naturally.
It's like, for us, if you go too deep, you're just like, there's just too many market segments. There's too many personas. If we're trying to create a media company for every single persona, like it's not going to work. So my goal is like highest level, what we can talk about as it pertains to like what we want to attach ourselves to. And then we can start to think about those layers, right? And like what that community looks like and how can we like leverage what we've built with the content that we've created. But it is like, if you're doing media on a large scale and you really want to build a media company, like you have to kind of take a wide approach to it. And a wide, but like can also be niche. It's really like, it's interesting.
Well, I was going to say this is perfect because I think we can just basically go into examples, like starting with ClickUp, I think as a good example. So how you're building Friday. So how do you think about the audience for Friday and the audience for ClickUp, and are they the same, right? Is one wider or are they generally like the same audience?
At the highest level, they're generally the same audience, right? Like we want to reach knowledge workers who are, working within companies, SMB, mid-market, enterprise, and all of those people tend to have, similar frustrations with work and silos and things that are blocking them and experiences with remote work and hybrid work and in the office. And that's what we generally want to speak to. And if we can hit people at that highest level, that's our goal to start. And then there's, of course, you can do things that are very specific to marketers and to, sales teams. And like, we can also pipe that in there, but overarchingly, like we want to reach people at work basically, which is good because it gives us room to play, gives us room to experiment, room to add humor into it without having to go so deeply kind of down that rabbit hole. But at that same time, like, yes, the answer is like, we also want to produce content that's relevant to very specific personas, but it's layered into the overarching strategy, which is just reaching knowledge workers.
Yeah. ClickUp is such a horizontal product, right? That you reach so many people. And as everyone knows, like there are just different types of challenges with that, right? With horizontal, like versus vertical. And so I'll give like an example of, a more like vertical product of Recorded Future, like being more of a security brand, right? And their CMO at one point said that they have like a few hundred accounts that they can actually sell into. So they're like very narrow in terms of like on the B2B spectrum. But they have like their own media arm that's called The Record. And I thought that was interesting because when I think about media, I think wide, right? Like you're trying to reach like a lot of people and establish that early audience. But I guess what they're doing kind of proves that there's like a use case on the other end of even when you have like a smaller audience, sometimes like just being like the go-to resource, like the only media company that exists for your category, that can work too. So I guess thoughts on when a media company is helpful for folks, like what type of B2B SaaS company can benefit from a media company or stand to benefit the most?
Yeah, I mean, kind of like what I said earlier, like I think every B2B SaaS company should be a media company. And I think to your point, it just depends on how verticalized you are, right? Like if you're selling into 200 enterprise accounts and like that's your, like, that's it. Yeah, obviously you're not going to create like a huge media arm that like speaks to every single thing that's like not, probably not relevant. You'd go like way, way, way more deep on that, like on those topics. Like here's an example, bad example, but like you are focused on accountants that need help on form 9997. And you know what I mean? Like if you'd be like, okay, exactly. I'm not going to create, the humor, like accountant's Bible. I'm going to create like a ton of videos that are like the absolute resource for these forms and try to do it in a way that actually like speaks to people and educates them and like helps them, right? And whether those are like long form videos on YouTube or their podcast to talk about why those forms are terrible and why they're X, Y, and Z, right? Like, but yeah, I think like when you're that narrow, like you can, again, like that's awesome. Like I think there's so much opportunity to go super, super deep on content creation and topics when you have like it's more finite. So I think it's like both, right? Like, because we need to reach everyone, like, and I mean, if, it's mirroring our billboard strategy for digital, digital, right? Like if we put billboards across every single market that we're targeting knowledge workers in, that should be our approach for social and brand and media. But if you're not doing that, your approach is obviously going to be very different.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Like you always need a media arm, or most SaaS companies stand to benefit from that, but the strategy is going to look different based on who you're selling into.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, like, how do you start a company today where you're not building media as the anchor and the forefront of that company? Like, I mean, I believe in PLG is still emotion, but like you have to. I think it's like it's a must at this point. It's not a nice to have.
Okay. Examples, like what are some of your favorite examples of SaaS companies that you think are doing this well?
I think Gong is doing a really good job. Like if I had to think of like a sales company that has like a personality and like a brand attached to it that's really strong, creating great content that's fun, cool, resonates, I would say they're doing a really good job. I would say there are a lot of other companies that are producing really interesting podcasts. Like Goldcast did a great job of like creating this amazing like podcast, obviously on their own platform, which is perfect because it just makes sense. But pulling out a ton of really interesting sound bites. You're constantly seeing them on LinkedIn. Yeah, I mean, I think, but to your point, like, I don't think anyone's gone like that next mile to what it can be. And that's when it like bridges into like true like proliferation of like culture. And that's kind of our goal with it. It's to not just be like, oh, like, yeah, they're kind of doing a good job. It's like, oh, wow, like they are a media brand at this point. Like they are so well known for their X, Y, and Z across social and brand that like you can't ignore them. And that's, again, like it still mirrors our billboard strategy. It's the same thing. It's like we put billboards just everywhere because we knew that these are where our people are and they're not going to be able to walk 10 feet without seeing ClickUp. And that's going to be our approach for building our media arm.
Yeah, so ubiquity like seems to be like a big goal of the media company. Any others, whether it's factors or goals that you'd want to bring up for a SaaS media company?
Yeah, I mean, I think we spoke to this earlier, but like paid media is just like a means to an end, right? Like you spend how much you spend on an ad and then the ad runs and then it's over and that's it. It like just stops. The ability to create something that's evergreen that can outlast your paid strategy is like a 5 to 10 year vision that you kind of need to have, because all of a sudden, we're in a, right? Like this is the perfect time to actually talk about this, because it's like everyone had infinite ability to raise capital. So pouring money into ads for growth at all costs made a ton of sense. And maybe they focused a little bit less on like the organic side of it while it was still probably top of mind. It wasn't, at a level red, like we have to do this. And now I think people are seeing, oh, wait, when capital dries up and we have to like completely reduce our marketing budgets, like how do we still grow? Because we're still expected to grow at the rate that we were growing before, but with less investment into pure marketing. So how do we do that? And the answer is to create content that can outlast that paid spend. And I think it's just, you're always going to be at the helm of platforms, like platform algorithms, like it is what it is. Like creating a media company, you're still like living on the rails of something, but you're not so much living on the rails of like, Facebook ad spends and changes to like your efficiency, because the efficiency will always go down. So there are so many platforms now that you can, even like with the changes in the dueling of Instagram and TikTok, like it's amazing because you can actually build an audience without having to build an audience, which is the first time this has ever happened. Like before it was, you have to spend all this money and all this time and content and effort into like building a following to actually build audience. And now that's really not the fact at all on many platforms. So I think that's a huge opportunity for brands to actually venture into media in a way that they, or B2B brands rather, in a way that they probably couldn't before, because it would have taken years.
That's a really good point. Technology and how embedded we are to social media and how much we've adopted podcasts and events and things like that. And really just remote work with COVID, like all of those factors kind of like collided into making like a media company even more worthwhile than it might have been 5-10 years ago.
Yeah. Very much. Like, I think it's just, people have been talking about it for a while, but I think this is the year we finally really see it.
Yeah, I like it. The other thing you brought up is, paid media, right? And so if nothing else, it goes back to that, like diversifying your marketing portfolio, right? And so if you have all of your eggs in this one basket and that basket gets really expensive and like untenable, starting to invest ideally early on, like starting to invest in the programs, in the organic, in the long term is going to just set you up for like a healthier marketing motion in general, right? Or media motion in this case.
Yeah, 1,000%.
Perfect. So metrics. I know we talked about goals and we've talked about like purpose. And so really when you're doing planning, like at the OKR KPI level, like what types of OKRs, what types of KPIs are you kind of like assigning to the media team? Yeah. Or we can back up and say, what is the media team? Who's on the media team, right? And then how do we goal that?
Yeah, it's like a kind of like a squad approach of people within my org and our growth org working together to create content that fuels all of these different platforms under this sub-brand Friday. KPIs at high level are just impressions. It's just like, hey, how many people can we actually reach? But then the core metric that I care about the most is engagement rate per impression, because then it actually shows you who's interacting with your content and what's resonating the most. Because impressions are impressions, right? Like impression could mean nothing. It could be like you see something on a screen for a second and you really don't even know the brand impression doesn't even make it through. So I would say it's definitely like engagement rate per impression, because that's how you tell what's working, how many people are sharing it, how many people are commenting on it, how many people are tagging other people in it. Like that's when you can actually say, hey, we're creating like a worthwhile conversation that people are compelled enough to share with other people because it resonates with them, or they see other people in it, or it's a common problem that everyone can relate to. So that's the way that I kind of look at it, where we have those two metrics. And to me, they're equally as important. Obviously, if you don't have the high level impression metric, the smaller metric matters less because you're not reaching as many people as you should be. But yeah, the engagement rate per impression, I think is definitely number one.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. So do you do that per platform, right? Like, are you looking at it at the platform level? How are you able to measure engagement?
Yeah, we're looking at it on the platform level and pulling it through the tool that we use to manage our social accounts. It's harder on certain platforms, but yeah, I mean, we're definitely dialed into that, because sometimes, something like won't do, like this is interesting to your point, right? It won't do really well, but it'll hit the right people. And I still think that's really important. And it's like, that's a great learning. Okay, so this got 20,000 views, maybe 50,000 impressions, but it had 2,000 comments, and all of those comments were people tagging other people in it, and it had 500 shares. Okay, well, that's certainly like, you need to take a look at that and understand who's sharing it, who are they tagging? Are they tagging other friends who are also other coworkers? And I think that's like when I get the most excited about a piece of content, it's because of that. It's like because other people want to talk about it with other people. So, I think that's definitely what we're looking for. So it's obviously hitting everyone, but then to your point earlier, it's like some of the posts, if it's super niche, very small, but it's really like gaining momentum within a specific audience. We look at that closely too.
Yeah. And I think just with your business model, those metrics make a lot of sense too, where they might change like a little bit, right? Based on a more vertical product. But for you guys, you mentioned, everyone at work, right? Like people that are working or do work can use ClickUp, right? And so with that large of an audience, optimizing for reach and then like engagement as well seems like the play. But if I'm going back to a recorded future or like a, more vertical product, like they may index a little bit more on the engagement side, like within those key accounts, right? Like versus like the reach.
Yeah, exactly. Like it would not make sense for that company to strive to hit hundreds of millions of monthly impressions. That wouldn't really, be a great use of resources.
Yeah, exactly. So just always trying to like clarify on the show of like, this makes the like perfect sense for this person. You may not be this person. So really like always going back to like, what is our strategy? What is our product, right? What goals are we trying to hit at the company level? And then backing those into kind of a media strategy.
I mean, it's much easier if you have like one target, right? Like if Gong is just talking to salespeople all day and can get into their psyche by creating amazing content, like that's awesome. For us, it's like we have to think so much more broadly than that. It's like, okay, we need to reach salespeople and marketers and engineers and product managers, and it's like, all right, so how do we, that is so overwhelming. But to think of it as that like that top layer of the onion that you can kind of like peel back, that's the way that I like to think about it.
Yeah, I keep going back to, I think it's Dave Gerhardt's quote of build a media company for your niche, right? And that most companies have a specific audience or have a specific niche that makes sense for it. But then with you guys being broad, I do think that one potential advantage, like to horizontal products and to like a broad market, is like the PLG part of this too, like being able to kind of like create, it's like you guys do and like plenty of other SaaS companies do, like creating those like really useful assets and connection points like between your media company and your product. So like anything you want to talk to on that side of like how you bridge media and product?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's like trying to get your rhythm within being a media company. But I think like once you can do that, you can really go hard on that, where if you're attaching thematically a piece of content that can be really humorous, entertaining, and it's like, do you struggle with this? Here's this. Use our template to get it, like there's such a great connection point from tying what you're producing to the actual solution to it. And I think to your point, like templates are a really great, like easy in way to being able to do that. So 100%, like it's, basically we created a piece of content 2 weeks ago. It was just like a fun test that we were doing. And it's called True Office Crime. And the first episode was about finding out who sent the Microsoft Teams invite to the whole company, because everyone hates MS Teams invites. So it did pretty well. And then what we would do in the future is like, okay, here's a template for like a team meeting invite that doesn't, include Microsoft, whatever. It's we can tie everything into anything that we're creating. So the beauty of that is, to your point, yes, it naturally and seamlessly can integrate into our product in a way. And that's definitely the goal. It's like, how can we tie that in? How can we inform and educate? So it's a mix of that humor and that education, but I think both can be natural, gateways into the product when you align the right templates and the right content and the right experience with it, right? I think it's to be like, okay, try ClickUp. It's like that isn't as, I think, focused as it can be, where that, to your point, if you create individual pieces of content, every single individual piece of content can be very focused into how that person gets into the product.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. All right. So the definition of like good content at ClickUp, I'm really interested in, because you brought up entertainment, education, and I think that balance, like for people, can be really hard, right? Like I've fallen into this of like going too hard on the entertainment, right? or, other companies going too hard on education, and it's just like so bland, right? It's just a white paper at that point. So figuring out like, what's that balance like, and how do you define like good content at ClickUp, or good, media content?
Yeah. I mean, on the education side, like, is it informing our audiences of something where there's a valuable takeaway for them? And can they connect that back to how to take an actionable step in their life, whether it's at work or in their life, right? And I think that needs to happen. Again, it's hard to tell because a lot of that is anecdotal. It's like, is it working? Are people watching it? Are they resonating with it? Are they sharing it? Are they engaging with it? But that's the purpose there. On the humor side, it really, like, the goal is to kind of connect the world in a way where, like, you're all experiencing things together, and we want to speak to that experience. Because as a company and as a product, the goal is to bring teams together so that they can work more seamlessly in one platform. And when we think about that as an extrapolation of that as like media, it's like, well, the world can also laugh together and about the things that they're experiencing, about the ridiculousness of the times that we're in, and things that happen on Zoom calls and at the office and within interactions and even within our industry. So I think being like creating that self-awareness of it and being like, we're all in this together, like kind of really is that extrapolation of like our product and the personification of our product as like a media arm. So that's the way that I look at it.
Yeah, self-awareness is such a good word, because I feel like when you don't have it, it's very obvious, like to the audience, right? It's it becomes cringe.
I'm also very blessed with like a really amazing team that comes from, a lot of them come from media. So the level of self-awareness is like very high. And we like toe the line so often of like, is it too far or like not far enough? And I mean, obviously sometimes I'm like, I don't know, like, but it's, yeah, I mean, we're definitely encouraged to like experiment and try things. And I mean, this isn't, it is media in a way. Like I always viewed it as media. Like when we would create ads, I'm like, why can't this ad go viral? Like there is no reason that this ad can't go viral. If we're creating, putting money into paid media and performance marketing ads, like they should definitely feel like media. And we did. We cut those up and we, created assets out of them too. So we've been kind of doing this day one. It's just in a different form of how we're approaching it now, or the next wave of how we're approaching it. But, we created this whole series against Jira. And one was like basically like a Saturday Night Live skit of like positioning Jira as this illness you're suffering from, and ClickUp as like, the saving pill, or the answer. So it was like basically like an SNL skit that looked like a pharmaceutical ad called the Beta Tool. It's like that's sort of the approach that we would take as a media arm too. It's like that's exactly what we would create, and that went crazy, like viral within the engineering community of people that were like, oh my God, like this is pretty amazing. But there was like such that towing of that line with that ad series that we created of like, okay, we're going pretty hard here against a big competitor. How do we do that? And then we also created a remix. Like, we've been thinking about, like, we think like a media company from day one. Anything we see like in the open, we're like, how can we ingest this and like create something that can go viral out of it? So another example is at Atlassian's conference, they gave us some airtime. They kind of alluded to like the fact that they had seen our billboards. They said our tagline, but wouldn't mention our name. And it was kind of a joke. It's like, we have so many billboards everywhere. You clearly know who you're talking about. And it was just like, I saw this billboard on the way to the airport. And we took the conference clip and we remixed it. We added a beat to it, and then we turned it into an ad for ClickUp. So it was, quite the kind of, stirring, I would say, of the pot, but it felt so right and it was done so tastefully. So it's just always that balance of looking at like how you're creating it. Like, does this go too far? Is it mean-spirited? Is it all in fun? Is everyone going to be like, oh, wow, this is like competitive jousting at its best? So we always think about like how, like what the perception will be of what we do before we take a risk.
Yeah, the competitive ads are so hard. Like they're so tricky, and there is like that line that you need to toe. But yeah, I will say that from what I've seen in airports, like and the screenshots that get shared over LinkedIn, you guys have done it, I think, a nice job. And I think like the competitive jousting like is probably like it's fun. Yeah, it's in jest, right? Like I think I saw one with like you and Airtable, right? And there it was a little back and forth like going on, and And I think that spoke to the fact that, like, you know, they were, competitive jousting, right? Like, they just took it as like a debate or a challenge.
I mean,
And
it's good for us. I love it. I think it's so much fun too when the industry can kind of poke fun at each other and play around a little bit. I think customers like it. Like, people like to see that. So I'm all in favor of a little competitive jousting and poking. I like poking.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say on this too, because all the commercial examples made me think about SaaStr. Like when we went to SaaStr like a year or two ago, I remember our VP of marketing at the time said, let's think about this as like the Super Bowl, and like, how can we be like the commercial that everyone's talking about, right? So I think that's a good way to think about media to some extent too, right? Is like, if this is the Super Bowl of SaaS, right? Like, how can you be, was it Coinbase? Like, that was like the last one that just like took over the internet, and like nobody could think of in any other commercial. Like, there's always one or two that just kind of like takes over. And what do you need to do to kind of be that brand? It's both like likable and toes that line, is not too cringe, but very, as you said, self-aware, right? And that's like, I think the difference of media companies in SaaS that make it and ones that are just not taken seriously as a media brand, that are just kind of like, this is marketing content, right? Like, there's a very fine line like between those two. And I think you have to intentionally say, we're going to create a media company versus we're going to create some marketing content. So rapid fire, I guess, here. So going through some of the logistics, it's 2023. I'm looking to set up a SaaS media arm, like where to start. And this could really just be like some of the early questions I think we've already gone through of like, what types of questions should I ask myself to figure out what type of a media company to create?
What kind of company are you?
Yeah, I should give you some more clues. Let's say like vertical SaaS, right? So I have a niche like within B2B SaaS.
Okay. Let's just say you're targeting salespeople.
Yeah, let's do sales.
I would start creating content that potentially is that same mix of humor and education, of like, these are the top things that you actually need to realize make a huge difference as an SDR or BDR, right? Start creating that video content. Get a great host, get someone that can actually resonate with salespeople, maybe a salesperson themselves that has like a personality attached to them, and start creating a character out of that and making sure that that character is the through line through all of the educational content you're creating. At the same time, I'd also create a more fun strategy where, maybe we're doing stuff like this, so I'll mention it, but like raps about like working with other teams and the trials and tribulations of being a salesperson. So like just kind of weekly or daily raps or, kind of quick bits about that sellers can really relate to. And then also like there's just memes and like lots of other different like sales content, like funny sales skits that we can create. I think Corp Bro does a really great job with his own media. He's his own brand with content like that. So I would definitely say that that's like the route I would take. Let's just say you're just targeting sales folks on the B2B side. I would build that.
Nice. Yeah, I love starting with like, what does good look like for us, right? Who's already doing it well. So finding some of those like role models, creating a little bit of like a mood board, and realizing that like, to me, and working in the sales SaaS space, like salespeople have, not that everyone has a sense of humor, but salespeople are especially more likely to engage with humor content, if that makes sense.
And share with their own like Slack teams and be like, oh my God, did you guys see this? This is hilarious, right? Or if you're targeting like your accounts, like incorporate some of it depends on how verticalized you are, but like incorporate your target accounts into some of your content, in like smart ways. I think people love to see themselves talk, and they love to see themselves be reflected in content. So the more that you can actually do that, the better, the more success you'll have.
Yeah, there's a real advantage with sellers selling to sellers, marketers selling to marketers, with being like, look, I am also a marketer. I get it, right? Like, I get your pain. Okay, nice. Next thing is a cadence. Obviously, this very much depends on budget, but let's say for this example that we are, 20 million in funding Series A, I guess, like to start. Of what kind of like cadence should I aim for in terms of like weekly content, monthly content, starting with the podcast? Where would you kind of get started in terms of, it could be program or channel, but what would be like a good cadence to aim for?
I mean, you need to be posting multiple times a day on the platforms that you're picking. So I would say if you're focused just on like enterprise clients, let's just say obviously starting on TikTok doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but starting on LinkedIn and creating a really strong LinkedIn strategy and a potentially really strong Twitter strategy might make sense, right? We'll see what happens with Twitter. But yeah, I think it's just like being more channel specific at that level. Like if you're trying to reach everyone, you need to be posting multiple times a day on multiple platforms. And those need to be like platform specific. Like some work is cut downs and others don't. So it's a complex question because it's kind of like, to be a true media arm, you need to be creating a ton of content. But if you're smaller, obviously the resources available to you to be able to create that are not probably there. So it's really being able to do what you can. But obviously, the more shots you take, the more you're going to be able to potentially reach the right people. Now, I'm not saying I value quantity over quality. I think quality matters a lot. But the more that you can start thinking about even what you're doing normally, right? If it's engaging enough, is there a way to repurpose that to help create your media arm? Are there things you're doing at the top level of your company? That's also where I would start. If I don't have budget or I don't have resources to create all the content I need, is there a way to repurpose the stuff that we are creating? And if not, should we start thinking about how we can change that content so that it can be repurposed? Because I think it's just finding leverage, right? If you can't do it to create it from scratch, then where else can you find leverage within what you already are creating? So, and how can you change that if it's not hitting the right people?
Exactly. I think that leverage can come from what's my existing talent on my team, right? Where are the superpowers? How do we lean into those? And then, going back to product too, where do we shine? What are we the best at? And how can we at least own that niche within the niche? So some things to think about for the audience. Last question. So resources. So this could be, it's going back to the people and tools. So what are the first few hires, that you should make in a media company? Obviously very dependent. So you could just speak from the ClickUp side if you'd like. And then if there's any tools, whether it be social listening or recording tools that you're these are my go-to, or if they're pretty interchangeable in your opinion.
Yeah. If you're truly creating a media arm, I would start with hiring producers, a few producers who can write and edit, and then someone that can create higher quality content and someone that can just shoot amazing stuff on the phone and kind of have that duality. Those people are supported by some of the creative producers are people that can just do both. They can edit and they can produce and they can write, and then having that group of people that can just ideate together and be able to produce a lot of things very quickly is ideal. In terms of social listening, we use Sprout. We're pretty happy with Sprout. It's challenging again to measure everything, but the more that you can do it with that, the better you can kind of prove out what you're working on. Another thing that I'll just say is that we are also heavily invested in turning our internal employees into a media arm. And, that's a big piece of it too. So, we leverage our resources to build up people as media channels, because I believe outside of what we're building with Friday and our brand media arm, our people are also a part of our media arm. So, we've dedicated resources to kind of going in and filming our people, answering questions that we think will be valuable to people in their network. Because then you also have this really amazing network effect, right? So, and also, the content that we create as a brand, we want them to want to share it out on their platforms. So the more they're building themselves up, everything kind of becomes a funnel into the brand anyway. So I'll just leave it. I know I kind of went off on a tangent on that point, but I'll just say a couple of creative producers, leveraging your own employees and having that sort of mix is a really great way of getting started.
Okay. Any last advice for marketers looking to create a media arm, or founders that maybe don't even have a marketing team that are I'm all in on media. How do I do it right?
Yeah. I think it's create a North Star. Who do you want to reach? How do you want to reach them? And how do you want to come across? And then what are the lines that you will and will not cross of how you get to market? Because there are ways to be very loud. And I think that approach works for some and it doesn't work for others. So I would say build that out, right? Figure out what your vision is for it and then start experimenting, just get started. hire a creative producer, start creating a couple videos, do a podcast. I think find the areas that aren't completely saturated. If everyone is doing podcasts, like maybe don't do podcasts, maybe do video snippets, right? Like find ways to reach people that aren't like completely saturated and maybe on the way out. Not saying they are, but just saying. And then, effectively just start creating and seeing what works and testing and learning and experimenting and iterating on it. And that's the only way you're going to possibly figure it out. I think it's like to be like, yeah, we're going to create a media strategy tomorrow. And then it's like, yeah, we're going to do it. And then you do it. And then it's like, oh, but that didn't work. It's like, it's just like so much trial and testing. So I think, my other piece of advice would just be like, have patience, it's something where you need to build it. You need to build it and you need to put the time and the patience and the resources into it to be able to build that.
Yeah, I love it. Well, Melissa, I got so much from this conversation. Thanks for coming on. If you just want to tell people where they can find you or if they want to learn more about ClickUp, now's the time.
Absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm very active there. Just message me, drop me a DM. I will respond. ClickUp is an all-in-one productivity platform that allows you to bring all of your teams and work into one place. I highly recommend you trying it out. We have an amazing conference coming up on February 28th called Level Up. You can learn more about our launch of our 3.0 version of our product and all the really other exciting things that are coming up within ClickUp. So excited to hopefully you can tune into that and drop me a line. Happy to chat.
Thank you again. We'll be talking soon, but thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Content Logistics. This episode was produced by Motion, a done-for-you B2B podcasting agency for busy marketers. If you liked what you heard, please follow the show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.